I still remember the look on her face, the first time her brand new electric SUV refused to charge. Not because anything was broken, not because the power company had made a mistake, but because for the first time in nearly half a year, someone had quietly reminded her that taking something that wasn't yours always comes with a bill eventually. My name is Ryan Mercer. I'm 43 years old, and if you've ever driven through the rolling hills outside Payson, Arizona, you've probably passed places like mine without giving him a second thought. 5 dusty acres, an old metal workshop, a faded blue pickup that has more miles than most people care to count, a couple of rescue dogs that think every stranger is their new best friend, and enough tools scattered around to rebuild just about anything with an engine. I make my living rebuilding diesel transmissions, not because it's glamorous, but because honest work has always made more sense to me than pretending to be somebody else. My wife passed away 6 years ago. My daughter is away at college now, and these days the shop keeps me company almost as much as the dogs do. Life was quiet until my new neighbor arrived. Her name was Savannah Brooks, 38 years old, recently moved from Scottsdale after selling some wellness companies she built online. At least that's what everybody around town kept saying. Within a month, she'd built a house that looked like it belonged in California instead of northern Arizona. Walls of glass, polished concrete, expensive landscaping that somehow survived our dry summers, and an electric SUV that was washed more often than my coffee mug. We weren't enemies at first. Actually, I tried pretty hard to be neighborly. I helped a delivery driver back a trailer into her driveway the day she moved in, loaned her a generator after one summer storm knocked out power for half the afternoon, even fixed a broken gate hinge without charging her a dime. She thanked me with one of those smiles that somehow managed to look polite and dismissive at the same time. Looking back now, maybe that should have been my first warning. Our properties shared an old utility easement that had been drawn up sometime in the late 70s when both parcels belonged to the same ranching family. Most folks wouldn't even know it existed because everything important sat underground. But I'd grown up helping my dad maintain this place, so I knew every conduit, every junction box, every transformer cabinet buried under those mesquite trees. It wasn't exciting knowledge until it suddenly became very valuable. Around early April, my electric bill jumped almost $300. I figured maybe one of my air compressors had been left running, or one of the lifts inside the shop was pulling more power than usual. The next month it happened again. Then again after that. I started replacing breakers, checking wiring, crawling around with a clamp meter in 90-degree heat wondering if something underground had gone bad. Nothing made sense. Every piece of equipment inside my shop tested perfectly. My habits hadn't changed. My workload hadn't doubled. Yet somehow my meter spun like I was running a small factory 24 hours a day. One evening I stayed later than usual finishing a transmission rebuild for an old rancher who needed his truck before sunrise. As I walked outside carrying a cup of cold coffee, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Running along the back fence where our properties met was a heavy-duty extension cord, thick enough to power construction equipment, disappearing through a gap beneath Savannah's side gate. I followed it with my flashlight until I reached my own outdoor maintenance outlet mounted beside the workshop. Someone had plugged directly into my power. I honestly laughed for a second because it seemed too ridiculous to be real. Who actually steals electricity from their neighbor like that? Then I followed the cord with my eyes again and saw the soft green charging light glowing on our SUV inside the garage. My laughter disappeared pretty fast. The next morning, I unplugged the cord, coiled it neatly, and left a short, handwritten note. I think you accidentally connected to my outlet. Please don't use my electricity. I figured maybe a contractor had done it during construction and she'd never realized it. By lunchtime, the cord was plugged back in. My note had been folded in half and tucked beneath a decorative rock, with another note sitting on top. It read, "You're seriously making a big deal over a little electricity. Neighbors should help each other." That sentence stayed in my head all afternoon. Helping each other wasn't the problem. I'd helped plenty of neighbors over the years. The problem was that help usually starts with asking, not assuming. Over the next week, I unplugged it twice more. Each time it somehow found its way back into my outlet before nightfall. Finally, I walked across the driveway and knocked on her front door. She answered wearing expensive workout clothes with wireless earbuds hanging around her neck like she'd been interrupted by something far more important than a conversation. I held up the extension cord and asked as calmly as I could, "Mind telling me why your SUV keeps charging off my meter?" She crossed her arms and shrugged. "Honestly, Ryan, you have a workshop? You probably don't even notice the difference. Besides, your place already has the infrastructure. It's easier this way. I stared at her for a couple of seconds, waiting for the punchline that never came. Easier for who? I asked. She smiled again. The same smile I'd seen the day she moved in, polite on the surface, dismissive underneath. Don't be so territorial. It's just electricity. Maybe to her it was just electricity. To me it was respect. And somewhere deep down I realized this conversation had never really been about a power outlet at all. The funny thing about people who believe they're entitled to everything is that they rarely stop long enough to wonder who actually owns the ground they're standing on. That conversation kept replaying in my head while I worked over the next few days, not because I was angry anymore, but because something about the way Savannah had casually said, "It's easier this way," bothered me more than the extra money on my electric bill. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't denied it. She'd simply decided that my property existed for her convenience. My dad used to tell me that whenever something doesn't make sense, stop arguing and start reading paperwork, because paper has a way of telling the truth after people stop doing it. So that Friday afternoon, instead of stewing over it, I drove down to the county records office. The clerk behind the counter recognized me immediately. Small towns are like that. "Morning, Ryan," she smiled. "Looking for permits?" "Actually," I replied, sliding my parcel number across the desk, "I'm looking for every document that has anything to do with the utility easement between my property and the one next door." She disappeared into the archive room and came back carrying a stack of old survey maps, deeds, amendments, and easement agreements that looked older than I was. I spent nearly 3 hours reading every page. At first it was the usual legal language nobody enjoys, but then one sentence made me stop. According to the original 1979 subdivision agreement, the electrical transformer, primary distribution cabinet, and underground feeder serving both lots had been installed entirely on Parcel A. My parcel. The neighboring parcel only received service through a shared private utility agreement because the rocky terrain made a second transformer too expensive back then. I read the paragraph again just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Then I flipped to the maintenance clause. Every repair, every modification, every major electrical installation affecting the secondary property required written approval from the owner of Parcel A. I leaned back in that old wooden chair and actually laughed out loud. The county clerk looked over and asked if I'd found buried treasure. "Maybe," I said. "Just a different kind." Before leaving, I made certified copies of every document. On the drive home, another idea began forming. Not revenge exactly. Something closer to accountability. I wasn't interested in shutting off her house. I wasn't trying to punish her family. I simply wanted her to understand that every shortcut has consequences. The following Monday, I stopped by Carter Electric Supply, a place I'd been buying parts from for almost 20 years. The owner, Bill Carter, was standing behind the counter drinking coffee. "Morning, Ryan. What project are we getting into today?" "Need a 50-amp contactor, a programmable current sensor, and a lockable enclosure." He raised an eyebrow. "Industrial job?" "Something like that." Bill knew better than to ask unnecessary questions. By lunchtime, I had everything installed neatly inside my own distribution panel. Nothing touched her house directly. Nothing violated electrical code. The system was surprisingly simple. The current sensor watched only the branch circuit feeding the easement connection. Whenever electrical demand exceeded 30 amps for more than a few seconds, the contactor would open briefly, then automatically reset. Ordinary household appliances never came close to that threshold. Lights, refrigerators, televisions, ceiling fans, they would never even notice. But modern fast EV chargers regularly pulled 48 amps continuously. I tested the system twice. Perfect, safe, completely reversible. Then I waited. That evening, right around 8 o'clock, I heard the familiar electronic chirp from across the fence as Savannah plugged in her SUV. About 15 seconds later, click, silence. 10 seconds later, power returned. 5 seconds after that, click again. I couldn't help smiling into my coffee. My phone stayed quiet, but I imagine hers probably wasn't. The next morning, she left for work driving her gasoline backup crossover instead of the electric SUV. Interesting. Day 2 was even better. I happened to be replacing wheel bearings on an old Dodge when I noticed her standing barefoot in her driveway, phone in one hand, charging cable in the other, repeatedly unplugging and reconnecting the charger while muttering to herself. Every few moments, the charger would restart, then shut down again. She crouched beside the vehicle, opened the charging port, closed it, restarted the app, even rebooted the home's breaker panel before trying again. Same result every single time. My apprentice. 18-year-old Mason glanced over from inside the shop. Everything okay over there? I shrugged without looking up. Depends who you ask. By the third evening, she marched across the property line carrying a tablet under one arm, still wearing expensive athletic clothes, frustration written all over her face. She didn't even knock. She stepped directly into my open workshop while I was rebuilding a transfer case. Your patience, I accept working another few seconds before setting the wrench down. My power? Yes, something's wrong with the transformer. Really? My welders have been running all day. She frowned. Then why won't my charger work? I looked at her calmly. No idea. She stared at me, clearly expecting me to fix the problem I'd supposedly caused. Well, aren't you going to do something? Instead of answering, I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a large manila envelope I prepared the night before. Actually, I said, handing it over, I was hoping we finally have a business conversation. She opened it with an annoyed sigh. The first page was an itemized accounting of the estimated electricity consumed over the previous 5 months, calculated using my billing records, average charging rates for her specific vehicle model, and photographs I'd quietly taken of the extension cord over several weeks. The second page listed reimbursement for the stolen electricity. The third referenced the easement maintenance clause from the original recorded deed. The final pages contained a proposed utility management agreement prepared by a local attorney I'd hired after reviewing the county records. Her eyes moved faster with every page until finally she looked back at me. What is this? It's what happens when somebody mistakes kindness for permission. She laughed, but there wasn't much confidence behind it anymore. You're kidding. I shook my head. You owe me for the electricity you've already used. Going forward, because the infrastructure sits entirely on my property, any high-load equipment connected through this easement requires written approval. That's been in the deed longer than either of us has owned these properties. That's ridiculous. Maybe. Still legally recorded. She flipped through the papers again. I'll get a lawyer. I'd expect you to. You'll lose. Maybe. I smiled. But your lawyer is going to read the exact same documents I did. She stood there another minute without saying a word. The confidence she'd worn like perfume ever since moving in had started to crack. She finally gathered the papers, turned around, and walked back across the driveway much slower than she'd crossed it. For nearly a week I heard nothing. No angry knocks. No threatening letters. No extension cord. Then one Tuesday afternoon my mailbox held a certified envelope from a downtown law office. I smiled, expecting a lawsuit. Instead, inside was a short letter requesting a meeting to discuss amicable resolution regarding shared electrical infrastructure. That told me everything I needed to know. Her attorney had already read the paperwork, and he hadn't liked what he found any more than she did. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning at his office, and as I locked up the shop that evening, I had a strange feeling the real battle hadn't even started yet. Friday morning arrived with the kind of quiet desert heat that makes everything seem slower than it really is. I walked into the attorney's office wearing the same work boots I'd been wearing all week, a clean button-down shirt, and hands that still carried a few stains no amount of scrubbing could ever completely remove. Savannah was already there, sitting perfectly straight with a leather notebook on the table, looking more tired than angry. Across from her sat her attorney, a gray-haired man named Daniel Foster, who greeted me with a polite handshake before getting right to the point. Mr. Mercer, he said, sliding the easement documents across the conference table, I've reviewed the recorded agreements and verified them with the county. Legally speaking, your position is considerably stronger than my client expected. I glanced toward Savannah. She wouldn't even look at me. Daniel continued carefully. However, litigation would be expensive for both parties, and I believe we may have a practical solution. He proposed exactly what I'd hoped would happen from the beginning. Savannah would reimburse every dollar of electricity she had taken, cover my legal expenses, sign a revised shared utility agreement clarifying future responsibilities, and remove every unauthorized connection immediately. In exchange, I would continue allowing her property to receive service through the existing infrastructure as long as the agreement was followed. I looked over at Savannah for the first time since walking into the room. Can I ask you one question? She nodded quietly. Why didn't you just ask me? That question seemed to hit harder than any legal document ever could. She let out a long breath before answering. Because I honestly thought you'd say no. I couldn't help smiling a little. You never gave me the chance. The room fell silent. Finally, she admitted something I never expected to hear. During construction, One of her contractors had suggested using my exterior outlet temporarily until additional electrical work was completed. Temporary turned into a few weeks, then a month, then several months because nobody stopped her, and eventually she convinced herself it wasn't really hurting anyone. Every time she saw my lights on or heard equipment running in my shop, she assumed I would never notice the extra usage. When I finally did notice, pride kept her from admitting she'd been wrong. Instead of apologizing, she doubled down because, in her own words, it was easier than being embarrassed. Funny how often pride ends up costing more than honesty ever would. We signed the agreement that afternoon. A certified cashier's check covered every penny I'd calculated, plus my attorney's fees. Before leaving, Savannah quietly apologized. Not the kind people give because a lawyer tells them to, but the awkward kind that comes from finally realizing they crossed a line months ago. I accepted it because carrying resentment is exhausting, and I'd already spent enough energy on the whole situation. Over the next several months, contractors installed a completely independent electrical service for her property, along with a large solar array and battery system. I heard through town gossip that the project cost well over $30,000. Every time someone mentioned it, they expected me to laugh or celebrate. Honestly, I never did. I just nodded and changed the subject. Revenge was never the point. Boundaries were. Every now and then we'd pass each other at the local hardware store or the grocery market. We weren't friends, but we weren't enemies anymore either. We'd exchange a quick nod, maybe a short conversation about the weather, and keep walking. The extension cord never reappeared, neither did the attitude that everything around her existed for her convenience. Looking back now, I think the biggest lesson wasn't hers. It was mine. For years, I'd believed being a good neighbor meant avoiding conflict at almost any cost. What I finally learned is that kindness without boundaries isn't kindness at all. It's permission. People who respect you don't need reminders where the line is. People who don't eventually run into it anyway. Every so often, someone asks if I should have just shut her power off the moment I found the cord. Others tell me I should have sued for much more money or tried to force her property off the shared easement altogether. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're not. Personally, I sleep just fine knowing I solved the problem without destroying someone's life over a bad decision fueled by arrogance. She paid for what she'd taken. She learned an expensive lesson, and we both moved on. But I'm curious what you think because people seem split right down the middle on stories like this. If your neighbor secretly used your electricity for months, would you have handled it the way I did? Or would you have gone much further? Let me know down in the comments because I genuinely like to hear where you draw the line between being a good neighbor and letting someone take advantage of you. And if you've ever lived through a property dispute, an easement battle, or a neighbor who thought your kindness made them entitled to your property, share your story too. Some of the craziest real-life experiences I've ever heard started exactly that way.